All right. Hello there. Happy New Year from the National Council for History Education. And history matters, and so does coffee. I'm Grace Leatherman, Executive Director of NCHE, and I'm here with Joanne Freeman, who is joining us for a New Year's message. So we thank you so much, Joanne, and we're excited to hear what you have to say.
Thank you, Grace. And thank you as well to the National Council for History Education, NCHE. I am here recording a special episode for you with my New Year bling earrings on because I couldn't figure out any other way to suggest that it's New Year's. To talk to you a little bit about what I've kind of summed up here as lessons and hopes. I'm going to talk about some of the lessons we learned in 2021, which I suppose can't be avoided. But then I'm going to talk about some of the hopes that we might have for next year. And there are hopes. And so I think it's important to end this year of History Matters. And I forgot my normal introduction. Welcome to History Matters and so does coffee. Okay, back we go. See what happens, I get out of practice when it's not every Friday. At any rate, lessons and hopes, which is a year-end kind of look back at what we saw and maybe the patterns that it fell into. Very historian mode of looking at things. What are the patterns and what do the patterns suggest to us? Now, if you've been following along this year, as I know so many of you come every Friday to do this, which I deeply appreciate and which, as I say every week, is important. Some of what I'm going to say here is not going to be new to you, but hopefully I'm sort of bringing it together in a way that will be suggestive and that will happily lead into some of the hopes for next year. And I should say, obviously, an obvious inspiration for this is it's the end of the year, and that's a moment when we're getting every top 10 list in the world, right? 10 best movies, 10 best book reviews, 10 best, 1,010 bests. I did not do a 10 best, but it's a time for that kind of reflection. It reminds me of some of the times that I've done research in personal papers of various people, particularly in the 18th century, but in the 19th as well. And not necessarily at year's end, but on their birthdays, people sometimes pause and write down in diaries more often, but sometimes in letters, what am I doing with my life? What have I done this past year? And it's always striking. I think it was it Meriwether Lewis of Lewis and Clark fame, who at some point when he had clearly achieved a lot, I did not look this up for this, but I believe it's Lewis and not Clark, who in a statement like that said something like, what am I doing with my life? Really? Because I know who you are, which suggests you've done some things. However, let's move on. Let's talk about some lessons. The first two that I'm going to talk about are really obvious ones, but I think they need to be stated. They're not new. As a matter of fact, probably none of these are absolutely new to what's going on right now. They still deserve to be said. The first two things I'm going to mention have to do with the tone and tenor of the politics of the past year. Number one is a politics of anger and bullying really works a lot. And I've talked about that at various points last year, the year before. I've discussed how it's important to think about what you're reading and how you're reacting before you react, because if you have an instant emotional response to something, it could very well be that that's the reason why someone threw that in front of your face. So it's easy. The point of a politics of anger and bullying is you don't have to think much. You just respond emotionally. And that kind of an emotional response that doesn't necessarily have a lot of thought behind it can be really powerful. And we witness that a lot. Politics that is grounded on nothing other than, well, if we do this, that'll make them really mad. Or if I say this to my base, that'll drive them crazy and then they'll be willing to do anything. So that kind of politics of anger and bullying is powerful. Requires people to step back and think about what they're reading without either falling into the emotion of what this piece wants you to think or instantly responding with outrage, which I will admit can be sometimes hard, right? I'm on Twitter a reasonable amount, and probably daily something comes whizzing past me on Twitter and my initial response is some version of what? What? Are you joking? And then I have to sort of like calm myself down, take 5 steps back, have some deep breaths. And inevitably, in one way or another, it's not, I did not need to respond like that. So I preach that to all of you. So we've seen the power in the last year of a politics of anger and bullying. I didn't have this on my list, but I was just writing to someone and I mentioned a politics of victimization. We've seen that a lot in the last couple of years as well, and particularly this last year. And by that, I mean, if you can continually depict yourself as the victim, you feel justified in attacking. It's emotional again and strategic again, and it makes what you're doing seem moral and correct and justified in some way. It's the same logic. It's the same reason why people who were engaged in honor disputes, they very much wanted to be the one who was challenged, not the one doing the challenging. Because if you've been challenged, oh, well, then you're sort of a virtuous person thrown off your feet by a dual challenge and you're doing what you have to do. You're the victim. If you're the person who is inviting someone to duel, you have to be a lot more careful with how you're portraying yourself. So a politics of victimization, anger, and bullying, that can be very effective. We've also seen, and again, this is not limited to the last year, but the degree to which out and out nonsense, lies, misinformation, inaccuracy, really just invented nonsense. The degree to which that persists and survives and influences people, the difficulty with which that can be countered, even if you're holding facts in your hand. Look, I was there and I have a photograph. I mean, we're at a point technologically where photographs, video, audio, so many things can be manipulated in so many ways that even if we have proof, that's difficult. And proof or not, in a certain way, if you have a certain mindset, you're just not going to believe what counteracts your worldview. So a politics of lies and misinformation also works really well. And in all of these cases, anger, bullying, victimization, and lies, all of those are things that do not do any favors to democracy. It's like the ultimate understatement. And indeed, another thing that I have here, again, not a brand new 2021 lesson, but an important one because we learn it in different ways all the time. And that is the fragility of democracy. The many ways in which not just that norms can be violated, and I know I've talked about that at some point in the past, that norms are there, we don't think about them, and in a sense, we perhaps don't think about them until they're violated, and then we realize, oh, there was nothing actually making that happen. People just sort of silently agreed that that was the way to do things. Norms are more fragile, political institutions are fragile, trust in the national government is fragile, and a democratic politics is grounded on a handful of things, and one of them is faith or trust in the process. That's part of what our Constitution does, is set up a process. So it ends up being a sort of pact that everyone agrees on. This is the basic way in which we'll run things. And then when we inevitably come up against difficulties, at least there'll be kind of a home base that we can touch that will help lead us out of difficulties. What we're seeing now is that things can be violated, things can be overturned, things can be ignored, things can be warped. And sometimes that happens with seemingly very little response. Right now, an extreme version of that, I would say, is January 6th, where we certainly are, well, we're not seeing it, we're hearing of people who did the storming of the Capitol being arrested, being held responsible. What we haven't yet seen, and I'm going to come back to this in a bit, what we haven't yet seen is if anyone within the government was involved, how they were involved, and what that means, and what we're going to do about it. That's pretty important. So another lesson that I have here, and in a sense, this one is stronger in 2021, and that is we've been watching a crisis of accountability. We've been watching what happens when people aren't held accountable. And it's tempting. And sometimes you can even argue and say, well, for the sake of unity and for the sake of the nation, let's not push this further, which we've heard a lot over the course of the last year. And there's an understandable logic behind that. However, if people do something that's in direct violation of the national, civil, political, government pact about how we agree to run our nation, if they do that in one way or another, and we all know it happened, and nothing happens, without that accountability, people who have power are not being held accountable for the ways in which they're using that power. And that's what underlies our system. We, the public, have the power to give political power to people. They, in turn, are responsible for how they used it, responsible to us. That's the back and forth. That's the dynamic of a functioning democracy. So if we give power, then the people in power do whatever they want, don't really care about addressing the public. They're just going to throw where we started, anger, bullying, lies, focus on that with politics and not really deal with realities, repercussions, implications, consequences. We're seeing a lot of that, and that's a huge problem. It's a huge problem, and that's one of the things I wrote about recently in the Washington Post, was the importance of accountability and how we're kind of not seeing accountability in so many ways right now, right? Not even just politically. Accountability, I don't know, people who spit on other people, unmasked people who spit on other people in a food store, or I'm sure you sitting there can think of an endless stream of things that people are doing that are clearly crossing lines in one way or another, and they're just doing them, and not only not having any sense that there's any consequence for that, they object when there are consequences. The most recent example is the fellow who said, "Let's go, Brandon," to the president at some Christmas moment. And, you know, he then got shocked that people got mad that he said it. It was meant as an insult. You want to argue it's a joking insult? Okay, it's a joking insult. It's an insult. And it was done so that people go, "Woo, wow, look at you. You said what we all want to say." Then when people turned around and said, "That's really inappropriate," he got outraged. That's called, you did this, and then you have consequences for the thing you did. So it's interesting that accountability in a lot of ways right now in the United States, repercussions, consequences, we're seeing a little slippage of that. And that's a damaging thing, because when that happens and there's no response, it basically gives permission for people to keep doing the same thing. The last thing I'll mention here, and it's related to everything that I've just said, I've mentioned it, not just this last year, but certainly this last year, is that I always refer to this as a we, the American we, that there is a sense, or at least has been a sense, that we as Americans in one way or another, even on a fundamental, really basic level, are a people. And that's a problematic assumption. And that's a tangled assumption. And as a people, even if you buy into that 100%, not everyone within that package is dealt with the same way as being part of the people. All of that said, a sense of some kind of a basic fundamental we, civil society we, is important. We're not doing too well on that front right now. We certainly haven't been over the course of the last year. The pandemic is like the ultimate test of that. If you're not willing to put a piece of cloth over your mouth, never mind even a vaccine, if you're not willing to put a piece of cloth over your mouth when you go food shopping, that's a problem. That's like you're basically announcing that you don't care about anyone but yourself. Another thing we might talk about, and this might be for next year, I won't do it now, is what that has to do with our sense of rights, what rights mean, and individual rights versus the rights of a people, and they're not the same thing. And I think right now, a lot of people are pretty invested in the individual component of that. We can come back to that. But at any rate, I think all of those things are lessons, most of which are not new to 2021. I do think the crisis of accountability is the big one because of January 6th, because of what happened at the very beginning of this year. Okay, so some of the lessons learned, I could go on, but I also don't, this is a New Year's episode, and I don't want to be 100% dark, which is why this is lessons and hopes. I've got some hopes. Here are some hopes. And one of them has to do with January 6th and is kind of a modest hope. And probably right now it's looking like a an achievable hope. Something I really want is for whatever hearings are going to happen about January 6th to be public, to be televised, to be widely available to the American public. Now, I'm not naive enough to think that if Americans watch that, they're going to instantly get a light bulb above their head and say, what have I been thinking all along? I've been really misled. I can totally see now that. So none of us really expect that. I don't think any hearing really could accomplish that. But hearings can do a number of things. Certainly, they can put things on record. They can put information out there that can be denied or traduced or whatever you want to do with it, but the information is out there. And some people, I would insist, are still persuadable. But more important than that, this gets back to accountability. If there isn't an aggressive and I think publicized hearing about January 6th, we are saying that that kind of line, that crazy kind of line crossing, attacking the US Capitol to overturn an election. So I can't sometimes even say that and sit here and think about the fact that a year has passed. But if that happens, and there's no real sense of accountability, even just in the form of a firm, documented, serious, formal, televised hearing, then there's no accountability for that action. So I said this, I might have said this in my Washington Post article. I did say it in an interview yesterday. I'm not arguing that a public hearing will suddenly poof create instant accountability, but I am arguing that without it, we're in dire straits, that the absence of that kind of moment of grappling with what happened and thinking about it and documenting it, the absence of that will be a big hole that will do damage. It's a weird counter argument, but I'm pretty firmly convinced. However, I do hear that the committee is planning on having public televised hearings. So as a hope, that's a small hope because it looks likely to happen, and I'm gunning for that. Another hope, which I also think, regardless of what happens with the pandemic, we have been doing and will do even more in the new year. Another hope is we really are not going to take a lot of things for granted, particularly now that there's this second crazy contagious wave. We had the first wave, which was horrible. We had a second wave, which was startling. We have a third wave, which is perplexing because maybe it's milder, yet it's more contagious. And we don't fully know what it means yet. However, I certainly, in the course of this pandemic that I have spent largely in one room, which someday I've got to write about this because it's insane. Me and newbie in one room. But I will say that at this point, there are a lot of things that I know I took for granted that I will never take for granted again. One of them has to do with buying a plane ticket, getting on a plane, and going to visit friends and family, going on a vacation, and not thinking twice. How easy it was for us to get together from far distances, to see family and friends, how easy it was to mingle in groups. That's another thing I'm not going to take for granted. Just hanging out with groups of friends. A friend of mine had a birthday, maybe a week, 10 days ago, and a group of 5 of us met, and we went to a restaurant that has outdoor tables, and we had masks on, of course, until we ate, which is the silliness kind of masks in restaurants, which is your mask till you sit down and then you take your mask off and it's like, poof, I'm safe. Realize it doesn't quite make sense. But at any rate, we did have that event. We haven't been together as a group forever. And it was such a reminder about what a great thing that can be. So I don't think we're going to take all of these things for granted ever again. Traveling, being with family, being with friends, being with groups of people. Personally, I will never take hugging for granted again. I didn't realize till the last year or so how much of a determined hugger I am. I hug people a lot. And I ask usually, can I? But my instinct, that's always my instinct. And it's been really hard. It probably took me almost a year to realize that, you know, we're at elbow bumping time. That's where we are. That's really not a hug. So human contact in various ways, we're not going to take that for granted again. And that's valuable. There's a value to that. What else? Okay, more hope that we are going to come up with a better way of dealing with COVID. And by that, I don't mean, what is the government doing? What I mean is, it was something that came out of the blue in a sense and startled us. And then kind of startled us a second time. And then we began trying to think about what normal means or doesn't mean. And we're still learning about the virus. This is a daily, even hourly changing situation. And there's a lot of impatience, and I understand it because sometimes I have it too. Like, why aren't people taking control and doing the right thing? And in some cases, that's because we really don't yet know the right thing. You can't make cement pathways at a moment of such change and immediacy and often urgency as the moment that we're in. So one of my hopes for the new year is related to that, which is with experience and now seeing what happens with waves and when they happen and different variants, new drugs, that will be in a different place. Already having a vaccine puts you in a very different mindset from how it felt at the beginning of this pandemic. A colleague of mine said, we're back to square one. And I said, oh, no, we're not. Because having that vaccine, just walking in the door and walking out with it was a world of difference. So we are not at square one, but we've got some squares to go. What else is on my list? Well, my hope, and I have hope for this, even though I realize that I am in public sounding dire, and even I'm here sounding dire. I hope, and truly do have hope, that the coming election in 2022 will show the staying power and resistance of democracy. I'm not denying that we're at a moment of danger for democracy. I'm definitely not denying that. I say it all the time. I can see Newbie moving around. Whenever I talk about democracy, he truly does get very activated. He is a history bird. What I want to see, and I have hope, that people will be motivated, that they'll be more aware of the risk. Even now, far more than we ever did before, we're seeing headlines and feature articles talking about many on the right walking away from democracy. It actually saying it appears that a major political party is walking away from democracy. That seems to me to have been obvious for a while, but if we're getting that now on the front pages, the covers of magazines, that's good. That's an improvement, that in one way or another, people are realizing that this is a moment that counts. So my hope for the new year is that people will continue to realize the importance of what's happening, that they will step up, that they will speak out, that they will certainly understand that this election is important, and that they will be willing to come together on a local level, on a community level, to do things, to organize so that people can vote, so that an election is functional, so that there isn't just a sort of slippage into, oh, this isn't working. I think that can happen. I truly do. And I don't think that's naive of me to think that can happen. I think that historically speaking, political change often starts on a local level, on a community level, on that level of organization. So although it's natural to look to national leaders to fix the problem, it's equally, if not more important, for the American people not to start battling with each other, just to step up and reinforce the electoral process. If people are trying to take it over for some purpose and deny access to things, you know, say generally speaking, there's bipartisan access to elections, or volunteer at a polling place. Just kind of put yourself in the mix. I'm debating, that actually is now on my list of things I might do. I don't know, I will decide. But I do have that hope that even though this is going to be quite, to use the word I always use, a fraught year, and that election will be quite something, it's possible that the runway to that election will really teach us something, and that's important. And that is one of my hopes. In that spirit. And I guess in a sense, this is the last thing on my list. The last thing I have hope for this year, and I think it's possible because I think in times of trial in one way or another, this often happens. It won't necessarily happen for us as a nation, but I think during times of trial, when you're struggling to understand things and you're looking to other people to help you understand things, sometimes that's a moment that really reminds you of the importance of community. I think the same thing that I just said, we learned the importance of traveling and seeing friends and being with groups of friends and family. The flip side of that is we are really realizing the importance of community. And that's really important because that really is the core, the anchor of democracy. Not one big community. I would like for there to be some vague sense of a national we right now, but talking beyond that, on a personal level, being in communities, feeling responsible to other people in communities, and operating on that, I hope, I don't think it's naive to hope that as this pandemic continues on, as the election comes nearer and nearer, people are going to be able and willing to come together in a sense of community to affect change, and will be more likely to do that than perhaps they might have been before. So I think that is my whole list of lessons and hopes. I have hope for the new year. I will not say that it will not be difficult. It will be difficult. However, this community, oh, okay, Carolee's not here again. Carolee is like, if you're playing bingo, I know you always put her name on the bingo card because now I don't remember the mug. I remember Carolee asking me to bring out the mug. This is the mug I brought for today, which will make obvious sense. It's the mug, actually, that Carolee made. This says, "Thank you for engaging in democracy every Friday morning." We have been doing that over the course of the last year. This will continue to happen. This community matters, what we do matters, and the awareness that this generates and the thoughtfulness that this generates matters. So I wish all of you a wonderful, happy new year, whether you, like me, will be sitting with a bird and a glass of wine, or if you're doing something else, whatever it is you're doing. Newbie and I wish a wonderful new year for you, a festive New Year's Eve. And I and Grace will see you in the new year.
We will. And on behalf of the National Council for History Education, Happy New Year's to all of you. Thank you, Joanne. Thank you for your message of community and hope. And you history educators and history enthusiasts out there give us hope every day. We're excited for what the new year brings. And we just wish you all the very best. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year, everyone.